Good evening. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. I am very excited and honored to welcome you to today's event, Moral Obligations in a World Afraid of Refugees. This is the first in a three-part series on the philosophy of immigration that we're sponsoring this semester. I'm gonna leave it up to Professor Matthew Lindauer, the main organizer of the series, to introduce you to both today's event and to the series. But for now, we are sharing on the chat a link with information to the next two events, and I invite you to please join us for those. I also want to take a little bit of time to thank the sponsors of the series, the Department of Philosophy and the Immigrant Success Office at Brooklyn College, who are the main organizers, the Departments of Anthropology, of English, History, Judaic Studies, Political Science, Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies, and Sociology, the programs in Caribbean Studies, Studies in Religion and Urban Sustainability, the Center for the Study of Brooklyn, and the Haitian Studies Institute of Brooklyn College. Thank you for your support for the series. I also want to invite you for another event on immigration that we are having tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. online. So in 23 hours and 50 some minutes. Come back and join us. Defining Immigration, Empire, Race, and Slavery with Professor Kevin Kenny from New York University and Professor Gunja Sengupta from Brooklyn College, who will together explore the influence of slavery on immigration law, the influence of race on empire. The link is also in the chat. And so please join us tomorrow at this time so we can continue today's conversation. I also want to join you to join us the first week of April for Hess Week, a series of 8 public events organized to honor the work of this year's scholar, Hess Scholar in Residence, historian Paul Ortiz. 25 speakers in 4 days, important discussions about academic freedom, the crisis of democracy, the role of solidarity in defending both, and the revolutionary potential of oral history. The link to that week's program is also in the chat. And lastly, please follow us on social media to learn more about the Wolf Institute's upcoming programming. And yes, the link to those pages is also in the chat. And with that, let me introduce Professor Matthew Lindauer, who will host today's event. He is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Brooklyn College and an Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He specializes in moral and political philosophy and moral psychology. His research focuses on the role that empirical facts play in the evaluation of normative concepts. So thank you for joining us, and please welcome Professor Lindauer.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Gaston. And again, thank you to everyone sponsoring this event and to your efforts at the Wolf Institute. Many thanks to the Philosophy Department and also the Immigrant Student Success Office on campus for co-hosting this event. I'm very delighted to have our speaker, Serena Parekh, who is a very important author and theorist in the philosophy of immigration literature. I'll go through her titles. She kind of needs no introduction. Someone like me, she's been really an inspiration in her work, bringing in a really interesting and exciting way kind of the theory of immigration justice and the practice of understanding the real life conditions that refugees face together in such a novel and important way. So Professor Parekh is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Northeastern University. She's the author of 3 books, including her most recent book, which she'll be talking about tonight, entitled No Refuge, Ethics and the Global Refugee Crisis, which won the North American Society for Social Philosophy Book Award and the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award. Professor Parekh has been interviewed as an expert on refugees in a wide variety of media, the New York Times, the BBC, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera. Other books include Refugees and the Ethics of Forced Displacement, and Hannah Arendt and the Challenge of Modernity, a phenomenology of human rights, which is also translated into Chinese. She's published many articles in prestigious journals, and writes on social and political philosophy, feminist theory, and global justice. And she's also a co-editor of the journal, a very important journal, Feminist Philosophy Quarterly. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Parekh to talk to us about her book, and we'll have a kind of conversation where I'll ask her some questions after that to learn from her expertise, and then we'll also open it up to our audience and to all of you to discuss with her and me. Please take it away, Professor Parekh.
Wow, that was a very generous introduction, Matt. I really appreciate it. It's really great to be here with everyone today. And what an incredible bunch of collaborators working on this series, and all the events that you listed were just so impressive. It's also wonderful that you have an office for immigrant success at your college, which sounds super important. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here with you. And I was asked to talk a little bit about my book. And I thought, because you're in New York, I might try to tie things a little bit to the migrant crisis, as it's called, that's happening right now in your city, like many cities, including Boston. And then sort of zoom out a little bit, to zoom into the crisis, and then try to zoom out a little bit. So I'll share my screen and talk for about 30 minutes, and then I look forward to having a conversation with everyone after that. All right, can everyone see a slide? Wonderful, thank you. I'm very glad to see that. Okay, so the title of my talk is Moral Obligations in a World Afraid of Refugees. And what I do generally in my work, and what I'd like to talk about today and hope we can have a conversation about, is how to think about the obligations we have to refugees. And I'll come back in a minute to that term and define it. But what do we owe to people who have fled their countries, show up uninvited to our doorsteps and ask for help? And really importantly, why do we have these obligations? And a slightly different but equally important and equally difficult question is, what obligations do we have to migrants, who I'll explain in a minute, are of course different from refugees. And I apologize if I give too much background information. It sounds like you're a group of people who have done a lot of work in this area, but I always like to try to define terms as much as possible throughout, just to make sure that everyone's sort of following, in the same page. So these are the questions I basically have tackled throughout my writings, as Matt explained. So I want to start by zooming in to what's referred to commonly in the media as the migrant crisis. And this, of course, refers to the fact that in many cities across the US, large numbers of migrants have arrived, and cities seem ill-prepared and unable to house, shelter, place them in homes, provide them with services. And of course, they're usually not permitted to work, so are more or less dependent on whatever government is in place. And this has caused a lot of strain on social services, some cases backlash against immigrants, where people feel like they've come, they're taking resources, there are just too many people, it's overwhelming. And so all of these together combine what's called the migrant crisis. And so we might raise the question, why are there so many migrants in New York City, Boston, et cetera? And the answer, of course, is really, really complicated. It has to do with a lot of different political, social, economic changes that have happened. For example, the people coming in through the southern border of the United States are very different than the people who were coming even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. We had more people from China cross over the southern border and claim asylum in the US than the last 10 years combined. Right? We have people from Ukraine, for obvious reasons. We have people from Russia as well, soldiers who are fleeing conscription. We have people from all over Africa. And you think, well, how did they get from all of those places so far away to the United States when there are other places that are safe countries where they could have claimed asylum? So what is going on here? Why are there all these people at the southern border? So that's what I want to focus on. And I just want to mention that one of the reasons this is a crisis, and not merely that there are many migrants, is because it ties into the housing crisis. There's simply not enough housing for residents, let alone migrants, certainly not enough affordable housing. And it, of course, ties into a political, the political animosity that we experience today, where migrants are being used very much as a political tool to embody, all the things that are wrong with one side, if you will. So they're a good political pawn in many ways. So all of these lead to the situation where you have migrants overwhelming social services in many cities in the US. So what I think could be helpful is to zoom out then and try to get a global perspective of like, who are these people? Why are they leaving their countries, and why come to the US? Why not go to other places? So let me again just do a little bit of background and say who a refugee is. So a refugee is somebody who is forced to flee their home country, and they're forced to flee and to cross a border, so they aren't internally displaced within the borders of their home country. And they were persecuted they're fleeing because they experienced persecution due to a particular reason: their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a social group. And this is what's known as the convention definition of a refugee. The US, by and large, uses this to decide who is a refugee and who is not. Other countries have more expansive notions of who counts as a refugee. The UN has a much more inclusive definition of who counts as a refugee. But you'll notice that people fleeing war aren't necessarily refugees. Gender minorities, people feeling persecution on the basis of their sexual identity, aren't necessarily refugees. And people fleeing because of climate change are notably absent from this category as well. Of course, this was written in 1950. We didn't know climate refugees, but the UN has actually held a position that climate refugees are not refugees. They're a kind of migrant. So let me then come to what's perhaps the most important set of distinctions for understanding the complexity of the situation. So a refugee is somebody who has crossed a border and is waiting in another country for somebody to give them the status of being a refugee. And if you are one of the millions of displaced people around the world, receiving this title is almost like winning the lottery, because with it comes a whole host of social and economic benefits. Now you might think, what? Like what are you talking about? Refugees are socially stigmatized. They're very poor. Life is incredibly difficult, and that's all true. But they are allowed to stay in the country that acknowledges them as refugees, and they're usually allowed to work. Some countries have other generous policies around integration, language classes, etc. But at the very least, they have the security of knowing that they're not going to be forced to leave. So a refugee then is somebody who goes to another country and waits there. An asylum seeker is somebody who bypasses the third country and goes directly to the country they think should give them refugee status. So what we see on the southern border are people coming in saying, look, I'm a refugee. I want to claim asylum. And there's no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker. All human beings have a universally recognized human right to seek and enjoy asylum. So if you are, imagine you're fleeing persecution because you're a religious minority in a particular country, you somehow make it to the US southern border and you turn yourself into a border guard and you say, look, I'm an asylum seeker. I'd like to claim asylum. Like, you have a legal right to do that. So that's what many people are doing. And historically, this has worked fairly well. There haven't been such large numbers of people coming in. Now, a migrant, sometimes called an economic migrant, a voluntary migrant, a migrant is the much larger term that's used often in the media to talk about all people who are leaving their home countries. Some of them will be forced. Some of them will be, technically legal refugees or asylum seekers, and others are people who are leaving for a whole host of other reasons. They might be poor, they might have lost their family for some reason, they might technically not be refugees, but in all senses, in a more colloquial sense, be refugees in the sense that they're forced to flee their home countries for whatever reason. Perhaps they're fleeing gang violence, maybe they're fleeing an abusive husband. So when we talk about the migrant crisis, we're including all of these people within the group. There's been a tendency from refugee scholars to say, well, migrants, you can do whatever you want with them, but refugees deserve protection. And I think what we're seeing today is really the problem with that, which is not that refugees are treated better, but that all migrants are treated very, very badly. And so I think when we talk about distinctions between refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in terms of our obligations, it's important to make sure that we include a minimum sense of dignity for all people, full stop, period, migrants as well as refugees. So I just wanted to disaggregate those terms a little bit, because what I'm going to be talking about now are refugees and asylum seekers, but there's actually no hard and fast way to pull apart these groups of people. So for example, a refugee is somebody who is maybe fleeing political persecution in their home country. But why did they leave? Well, it's possibly and often likely tied to their economic situation. If you're politically persecuted and you have enough money and you're comfortable socially, you might be able to stay in your home country. But take that same persecution and amplify it with poverty, all of a sudden it becomes impossible to remain in your home country. You have no protection, nowhere to go, so you're going to flee. Well, would that person then be a migrant because they're leaving for economic reasons, or would they be a refugee because they're leaving for political reasons? The answer is always political. It depends on who you ask. But my point is that it's very, very hard, and we should be very humble when we try to disentangle these groups and say one group deserves rights and protection and another group doesn't. Okay, so I think what's helpful to understand is what happens to refugees in the 21st century. And in order to understand that, it's helpful to think about what's supposed to happen to refugees in the 21st century. So the modern refugee system begins at the end of the Second World War. The UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is one of the first UN organizations that's founded in 1948, and it's founded to implement the Refugee Convention, the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, from 1951 as well. And in this document, they say, look, we just went through the Second World War. We saw millions and millions of people displaced. And in particular, we saw many Jewish people displaced from Germany, Poland, and other countries. And had the international community acted more effectively, many thousands, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people might have been saved if we had a better refugee system. So look, let's get together as an international community. Let's think about some solutions, and let's all agree that next time we have a refugee crisis, we will give them one of these three solutions. So one solution is to facilitate voluntary return, which just means, the UN, various countries will work to facilitate the end to the war, the end to persecution, so that people can voluntarily choose to go home. Because at the end of the day, almost everybody wants to be in their homes and would love to be able to go to their home countries. So that's considered the preferred option. The second option is called local integration, which just means, you've crossed your border to escape persecution. Years go by, and you fall in love, you get a job, and so you become a member of the society. You integrate over time. Perhaps you're allowed to work, perhaps you're allowed to go to school, your children become citizens, etc. And the third option, which wasn't really considered to be something that would be totally necessary, it was sort of an emergency thing they thought might help in some very small number of cases, is resettlement in a third country, in a new country. And this would be, for groups of people who simply can't integrate into the host country for whatever reason, and need to be resettled in a country like the US, Canada, Australia, etc. So all in all, this worked fairly well for large numbers of people for large periods of time, though I will point out, until 1967, this didn't apply to people outside of Europe. So we actually see, of course, large-scale displacements around the world. I think of, India and Pakistan in 1948. Over 1 million people are displaced, but they wouldn't have been under the purview of this document. They wouldn't have been considered officially refugees at the time. Starting in 1967, the temporal and physical limitations were taken off. So you had to be a refugee from before 51, and you had to be from within Europe. So this gets taken off, and all of a sudden, people all around the world are eligible for this title of being a refugee. And by and large, things functioned fairly well until about 1980. And then you see the advent of a number of civil wars across Africa and a hardening of migration and immigration in general in Europe and the United States. So it becomes harder to immigrate legally. If you are, a young African, you want to go and make a better life for yourself, it used to be the case that you could apply for a visa and go and work in Europe the US, etc. And all of a sudden in the 1980s, it becomes much, much harder to do this. So these countries become more like fortresses. So if you want to leave, you kind of have to go, without any documentation. You show up in a new country and you say, hey, maybe I'm a refugee. And maybe you are, and then you are allowed to enter the sort of refugee process. And maybe you're not, but you're now in the country and you can work, you can live, you can send money home, etc. So the problem then is what happens starting at this point. So 1980s, you have countries becoming increasingly skeptical and worried about illegal immigrants coming into their home countries. And so to prevent illegal migration, you have to make it harder for refugees and asylum seekers as well to seek asylum. And for a number of reasons, resettlement also becomes simply not something that countries are interested in doing anymore. During the Cold War, it was much more popular because there was a kind of political weight to it. It was seen as an embarrassment of, all your Russians want to come to the US, we'll take you because, it sort of looks really bad that these citizens want to leave their home country. After 89, this is no longer needed, so resettlement goes way, way down. So today, since 1980, fewer than 1% of refugees globally have ever been resettled. So resettlement in a third country simply isn't an option. The vast majority remain hosted in developing countries. So I want to stress two things. Most refugees and asylum seekers end up in the countries proximate to where they're fleeing. So that initial flight where they're fleeing their home countries, they cross a border, most people end up there. And this is surprising to many people in the US and in Sweden and Germany, because it seems like, well, everyone's coming here. We have so many people. And actually, that's a very small percentage of the actual numbers of people who are forcibly displaced from their homes. So most remain in the global south in developing countries. And I say that they're being hosted, which is to say they're not integrated. Very few people have legal rights to work. Very few people are allowed to stay. So they might be tolerated is the phrase. So they will not be arrested. They will be allowed to sort of work under the table, but they don't have any official rights. So they live in extremely precarious situations. And fewer than 2% of refugees are able to return home. And if you think of the way crises become protracted, you have the Syrian civil war, which starts in 2014, and we don't hear about it anymore, but it's still ongoing. And if you are an enemy of Syria, it's still not safe for you to go home, even though, it's going on 10 years now. And what to me is so striking about that is you hardly even hear about the Syrian civil war. Countries are normalizing their relations with the Assad regime, but refugees still remain refugees. They still cannot return home. And the length of time a person is likely to remain in this kind of limbo situation where they can't go home, but they don't have any other country that is willing to consider themselves a citizen is something like 17 years. And 25 years for people who are fleeing war situations. So these situations, like the Syrian civil war, that become very protracted. So what we see then is that the durable solutions that were envisioned at the end of the Second World War are actually almost of no use to refugees today. So the solutions that we were promised refugees, we aren't actually able to implement. And the result is not that refugees just go home and carry on, but rather they remain displaced, they remain in these sort of limbo legal situations for decades. Okay, so then what can you expect as a refugee in the 21st century? So imagine you are, a Ukrainian and you somehow weren't able to get into Europe, you felt you were unsafe there, you are fleeing the civil war in Africa, you're fleeing political repression in Eritrea. You can go on and on, of course, with any of the conflicts. You're fleeing gang violence in the Northern Triangle, you're fleeing climate displacement in other parts of South America. What's going to happen to you? What does the international community in fact offer to you? So I'm going to suggest there are three options. There are three real options that are given to you. And I'm going to explain each one and then explain what I think is significant about these for thinking about our moral obligations to refugees. So the first option are refugee camps. The second are informal urban settlements. And the third is seeking asylum directly. And in all three cases, the options that are provided to you fail to protect the minimum conditions of human dignity. So far from that idea that you could be resettled or voluntarily returned, refugees and asylum seekers are not able to maintain the minimum conditions of human dignity. And so I'll talk about these a little bit, and what I want to conclude with is, like, once you realize this, it is not surprising that we're seeing hundreds of thousands of people show up in any place they feel like they have a chance at getting dignity. Okay, so the first option are refugee camps, and these exist all over the world. In Mexico, most recently, though it's not officially a refugee camp, basically in all kinds of spaces where refugees are asked to wait, wait for a solution. And refugees, and we know that this waiting is not like a week or a month or two, it's years and often decades. And the conditions are often, or are almost always, with very few exceptions, terrible. Right, so they can sometimes provide some security, some food and water, some opportunities for education. But to live in refugee camps requires that you give up your autonomy. You're not allowed to come and go freely from refugee camps. You're never allowed to work. So that means you have to be dependent on whatever the international community will give you. Food is at best meager. And things like gender-based violence are endemic across refugee camps. And remember, this is not something you might pass through temporarily. This is going to be for 17 years. This is Dadaab in Kenya, which was built for 90,000 people in the early 1990s, now holds about 500,000. And until the Rohingya genocide a few years ago, it was the largest refugee camp in the world. Now, of course, that's in Bangladesh, as Cox's Bazar, which holds close to 1 million Rohingya refugees. What's so terrible about rape? You don't die from it. This is a characteristic we see in all refugee camps, whether you're in Italy or you're in Africa or you're in Mexico. And the sexual violence is done by workers, often by other refugees, and by people from the surrounding communities. I mean, you have extraordinarily vulnerable people in very crowded situations, very, very little security. So why would you go to a refugee camp then if you were a refugee? Well, often that's your only choice. You may not have any other ability to leave, to go anywhere else, or any other resources to do that with. But it's your only chance of resettlement. But if you remember that you only have a 1% chance of resettlement, it's all the more puzzling why people would stay in refugee camps. So starting in about 2005, right, 2005, you have the Iraq War, you have a lot of middle-class Iraqis fleeing Iraq, very well socially connected, and really starting to understand what it means to live in a refugee camp, and deciding, you know what, I am not doing that. So oftentimes they will go right through or around and just bypass refugee camps. They will not register with the UN, and they will simply go and live in a city with friends, family, co-nationals, whatever they need to do in order to survive. They'll work informally, they'll send money home. They have complete freedom of movement, right? They're allowed to come and go as they please. Sometimes you might be very proximate to the country you're fleeing. So urban refugees in Lebanon might be able to go over to Syria, check in on their grandmother, come back. But of course, it's terrible in many, many ways, right? Fewer than 1 in 10 urban refugees receive any kind of help from the international community at all. Housing is catastrophic. Workers are exploited. You have very few rights because everyone is tolerated. You don't have any legal right to work. So if your wages are withheld, if your employer beats you or abuses you, I mean, you can't go to the police. You have no legal recourse for it. So and many refugees are in extreme debt and then indebted to, very, very in bad conditions. And many people will say that among the worst things is the simple absence of education for their children. And again, this is not a month or two, but this is years and decades. So you have generations of urban refugee children who are growing up with little access to formal education. Okay, so then you think, this is terrible. I don't want to do this. Like, so I'm asking people to imagine themselves in the situation. You're forced out of your home for whatever reason, and you believe if I go back home, I will be killed, I will be tortured, I will be raped. I can't do that. Refugee camps are atrocious. I can't spend my life there. I can't raise my children there. Life in urban settlements is similarly terrible, though maybe in slightly different ways. Well, your last option then is to seek asylum. And what that means is to directly try to enter a country that you think will recognize you as a refugee. So Europe, Canada, the United States, Australia. And these countries also recognize that this is what's happening. And what they have done and have done increasingly is to put in place what are called deterrence policies or non-entree policies. So these are things that make it extremely difficult to cross deserts, oceans, borders to try to seek asylum. So it means effectively, if you are a refugee and you want to seek asylum into any of the countries I mentioned, you have to use smugglers. There are other ways you can come in caravans, but there needs to be some kind of organized effort that often requires you to pay large sums of money. So people, again, go in debt, asks you to make yourself vulnerable to violence, and in many, many cases leads to death. You know, we know tens of thousands of people, well, 30,000, somewhere like 30,000 people have died in the Mediterranean in the last 10 years trying to cross from Libya and Turkey to Italy and Greece. So it's extremely dangerous. And you think like, okay, well, why would you do this? Why would you bring your children on these flimsy boats? How could you take such a risk? And I think the best answer to that is this Eritrean proverb that I read, which is that a dead goat doesn't fear the butcher's knife. So if you've been following me so far, you know that the people who are taking these journeys, who are going through the Darien Gap through Central America to get to the border of the United States, are doing it because they believe they have no other chance at a minimally dignified life. And that doesn't stop states from trying to make it as dangerous and as deadly as possible as a way of deterring migration. But this also helps to understand why, nonetheless, migrants keep coming. So this is the global refugee crisis. I think this is the context that the migrant crisis in New York City needs to be understood in. The vast majority of refugees stay in the global south, so they actually remain put in underfunded, insecure camps or in urban squalor for decades, with a very small chance of being resettled. So that's the reality that people know. And if you were a refugee and you knew this, it wouldn't be surprising that you would take your chance of being smuggled into the United States, making your way through these incredibly dangerous journeys to try to get into the US. You might have a cousin here, you might have a friend here, you might have heard how terrible and dangerous the border is, detention centers are, but nonetheless, given what the other options are, it's still better. Risking torture, sexual assault, and death. So I want to be mindful of the time and stop here. But where I think philosophy can play a role is here. If we realize that when migrants are fleeing is not merely the distress, the poverty, the danger in their home countries, but they're also fleeing the situation that we have created. And by we, I mean members of the international community, citizens of countries like the US, Canada, Europe, who have by and large put in place policies that make it the case that if you are a refugee, you have very, very little chance of what every human being wants. Basic security, a chance to raise your children, a chance to eat and sleep in peace. So there is no other option. The only options we've given them are these extraordinarily dangerous ones that result in what are for us crises, right? These crises that we have in cities. So it doesn't work for anyone, clearly, but it especially doesn't work for people who are being harmed by this situation. So then when we think of, well, what do we owe to refugees? What I suggest in my work is that most of the moral frameworks that philosophers are working in aren't really effective because they assume that we have done nothing wrong. We are just innocent bystanders, happily, innocently living our own lives in the United States. Asylum seekers come knock on our door, and we can decide for ourselves if we want to take them in or not. And what I think that framing is wrong, and instead we should see ourselves as somebody who has contributed to the harm that they are fleeing from. And therefore, our obligations are not only to include them, but to really rethink this system so that there are other options in addition to asylum and more just migration policies that we might be able to provide for them. So I want to be mindful of the time and not talk too much so we can have more of a dialogue. So maybe I'll stop there if that works for you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. That was perfect. I think it gives a great background to your work for people who haven't read the book. And I know that when I first saw you give this talk talking about some of this work in Norway a long time ago, it actually had a huge effect on me.
Thank you.
So yeah. So that's actually related to my first question. And these are just kind of more invitations for you to kind of talk about your approach than any kind of, thing that I find it all very compelling. I think everyone should read the book. So the first, question though is about kind of your mix of kind of storytelling and philosophy and how you see the value of storytelling. So often, I think traditionally philosophers have kind of thought that it was like the power of reason alone was something that we were trying to emphasize. But I think your book is just such a great example of how, you mentioned kind of your fear of flying early in the book and how some people who had tried to kind of help you with that and kind of course had not really not emphasized kind of the difficulties with turbulence that you were, having. And then story of Alberto and his family fleeing gang threats in El Salvador, or Sina Hapta, the pregnant Eritrean asylum seeker who was previously a chemical engineer whose body wound up limply floating off the coast of Greece and who was actually rescued, and this kind of a positive story. So how do you think about the relationship between storytelling and kind of making the case morally? Do you think there's kind of a lesson that you've learned through working on this project about that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I have two books on refugees specifically, and one is a very scholarly academic book. And this book came out in 2016, right before the Republican nomination, where Trump, of course, eventually got the nomination. And in this moment, refugees were really being thrown under the bus. They were the cause of, national security crises and so forth. And I was doing a lot of public talks then about the book because this was this topic in the news. And I would, give my arguments and talk about different theories and so forth. And I remembered a few times people would say like, look, I get all that, but like somehow I'm still afraid. And I realized that the political discourse had managed to shape things so deeply that even people who wanted to think differently, who believed differently, had somehow just started to be afraid. And I realized that I needed to address that directly. And so the story about turbulence that you mentioned is that, I used to be afraid of flying, and I decided to take this fear of flying course. And the instructor, explains how planes work, how safe flying is, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, everyone who's there is still like completely unconvinced. And we said, like, well, what about turbulence? And he said, oh, like that's so from a mechanical point of view, like it's a non-issue. It's just the wind current. And pilots can just adjust for that and move into a different current. Like it's not dangerous at all. But nobody had heard anything else he had said because we were all we just wanted him to explain turbulence to us. And so my thinking is that if this thing is on the front of your mind, namely that refugees are terrorists, they're rapists, they're economic threats, it's hard for you to be open to listening to arguments for why we should take our moral obligations to them more seriously. And, I could come across some social science work about fear and how reason, making arguments actually, not only does it not work, but it often deepens people's views about things. So for example, if you've been convinced that vaccinating your children is dangerous, actually providing just evidence for why it's not rarely changes people's minds, and it often makes that fear even more deep. But if you tell a story about a child who died because she wasn't vaccinated, like that's enough to shake people up and allow them to at least be open to questioning their ideas. So that's what I wanted to do with the stories in my book, is just connect with people enough so that they could say, oh, wait a second, like this woman, she was a chemical engineer. What was she doing in the Mediterranean? I thought they were all rapists and terrorists there. And then you realize, oh, like, she was just a middle-class person, and this stuff happens in her country, makes it impossible for her to stay, so she has to do this journey. And I hope people could see themselves in their lives in different ways, as parents, as fathers, as mothers, as my audience when I write is often my students. And so I always imagine my students, you're 18, 19 years old, like you're so ambitious, you have so much drive, and you want to do so many things in the world. Like, well, what would you do if you were told you can't go to school, you can't leave your country, you can't live in safety, you can't get married to the person of your choice? Would you stay? Like, well, no, but so to try to invite people to just be a little bit more open and to shake that up a little bit, so that hopefully they could be open to thinking about the more reasoned intellectual arguments that I also try to make in the book.
Wonderful, thanks. That's a great answer. I'll ask, so just in terms of format, I should have mentioned again that this is kind of going to start out with like a little conversation between Professor Parekh and I, and then in just two more questions, we'll open it up to the many buzzing questions that I know many other audience members have. So one other question that I had as kind of part of that first stage is just about kind of a strategic question about the framing of the book. I really think it's such a brilliant idea to focus on what you call the second crisis, which is this crisis, I take it, where it's almost like there are these people who are falling into this very dangerous situation, and we've just removed the parachute that could catch them, right? We've made it kind of impossible for people to reach safety, and that crisis is one that we bear responsibility for in an important way. So that's a really nice thing to emphasize that I don't think anyone else is emphasizing in quite the same way as you are. I was thinking about that as a kind of responsibility and then there's this other kind of responsibility that we might have, right, that often gets talked about, especially by people who are concerned for refugees, is just the kind of the West's, role in global inequality and kind of other causal mechanisms. So if it's South America, we were talking in the ESO office with some students recently, just talking about the United States' role in violent opposition to democratic movements in recent history in the 20th century, and how that has enduring effects on political stability. There are many other stories to tell about global economic inequality and imperialism. So I was just wondering, there are times in this book where it's not as if your view is incompatible with that kind of focus, but you say things like that we might have a right to exclude refugees or make their entrance to our countries difficult, we ought not to. And you talk about national sovereignty. And I was just wondering if this is kind of like imagine someone didn't already accept that the West had all this responsibility for the causes of these problems. They're still on the hook for the dangerous situation, right? We're not providing kind of the second crisis. We're not solving that second crisis of providing safe haven. So is it kind of a strategic thing, or is it that you think that crisis of not providing the safe haven that international law is supposed to provide is more primary? I just wanted to hear you kind of say more about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was more strategic. My aim was to sort of start with what I take to be a widely shared assumption by most people outside of philosophy, namely that sovereign states have a legitimate right to control their borders. And to some extent, I think even philosophers, even sort of open borders philosophers, believe that, because if you believe in democracy, like you have to be able to curtail who is part of the demos. And if what you want is your government to be responsive to you, then the you has to be defined in some way. So if you are, you could set the criteria for legitimacy in different ways, but if you are a legitimate state, you should be able to control who comes into your country and who doesn't to some extent, moderated with human rights principles and so forth. So that was absolutely my starting point. I think people are right to point out that should not be taken at face value. And there's a wonderful legal scholar named Tendai Chume who makes this argument that because of the history of colonialism, countries are so deeply interlinked with each other that we should see formerly colonized countries and colonized countries as being part of the same sovereign state. So it's a very radical argument, but the idea is that through histories of colonization and neo-colonization, countries are so deeply linked that we should see ourselves as being co-constituting and responsible for each other in the same way that we're responsible for fellow citizens. So I don't think that's wrong. For the book, for No Refuge, it was really just aimed at people who that argument was just out of the question. And it's just, look, I'm an American citizen. I love my country. I want what's best for it. Why do I owe something to refugees? Well, it's because we don't even have to go as far back as colonialism. We can just look at the way that refugees are being treated and our immediate role in that processes. And this is what gives rise to our obligations to refugees. So I think you're right. I think they are compatible with each other, but it's sort of just aimed at different audiences.
Wonderful. And then the last question, first kind of setting the stage a little bit, and we'll get to some audience questions that I just had to ask is, so you've done this really interesting thing, kind of bringing theory and your experience, kind of going and learning about refugee camps and the real situations that refugees face together in a way that just very few people had done in philosophy. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about the choice that you made to step outside this mold that philosophers had kind of been in and how you decided to do this. Like, do you have any advice for other scholars who might want to do something like your work, but are concerned about like disciplinary boundary policing or kind of the demand of certain kind of traditional approaches that are much safer, but maybe less rewarding? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So I was lucky to have tenure at the time of writing the book, and I was also very lucky to be in a philosophy department that really valued public-facing scholarship. And I think both of those are important, to have communities that value what you do and the sort of jobs freedom that allows you to write on the things that matter to you. I mean, I don't know that I would have done it if I had been in a traditional philosophy department that only counted and not only counted, but only values you insofar as you are hitting these disciplinary achievements. And I think that's unfortunate because that's great that people do that work, but I think there's a lot of important scholarship to be done that's interdisciplinary, that transcends boundaries, and that makes connections to the issues that people really care about. And my experience with that first book and doing public talks was that people really wanted to understand what was going on. Like, who are refugees? Why is everyone so angry at them? Why do they keep coming? And that wasn't being answered by, writing peer-reviewed articles. And again, I think that's super important, and a lot of the discourse and the nuanced understandings that come out of that are super, super important. But I hope that there is also a place for, and an appreciation of both interdisciplinary work and public-facing work. And there certainly are scholars that are able to do that. So, I guess the advice would be to seek out like-minded scholars and try to connect with them and try to, the North American Society for Social and Political Philosophy, for example, is a great organization that also really values work that contributes to ongoing social problems. So there definitely are places like that in our communities like that. And, hopefully departments, also can have space for that kind of scholarship.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And I know that our community is very receptive to the kind of work that you're doing. So it's great to have you here. I do want to make room for audience members. And the first will be just her microphone, I'm told is not working, but Professor Okome had written in the chat. What about the Refugee Convention? I'm just reading here. What about the Refugee Convention? Most countries are party to it. Isn't it a violation of international law when countries decide that admitting refugees is an optional choice?
Yeah, I wish that were the case. So when the Refugee Convention was written, so actually let me back up. yeah, the Refugee Convention and the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, were both deliberately designed to be very, very ineffective and to be dependent on donor countries. So the UNHCR is the only UN body that does not have automatic funding every year. Every other part of the UN gets a percentage of the UN's budget. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees every year has to fundraise to individual countries. And so this makes it very dependent on those countries. In the Refugee Convention, there is no obligation to resettle refugees. So if a country decides, you know what, I've taken in 10 refugees this year, that's enough for us, they actually have violated no obligation. And part of the problem is the strongest obligation that's in the Refugee Convention is the obligation around non-refoulement, which means that if somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution is on your territory, you cannot kick them out. You cannot force them to leave. And this is in part why these deterrence policies have arisen with such ferocity. Because if you have a legitimate asylum seeker, once they're in your country, they have a right to stay. So it's much, much better for you if you don't want them there to prevent them from coming, to deter their boats, to not rescue them at sea, to make it illegal for other people to do that, to make routes that could be made safe dangerous and deadly because you don't want to have to process asylum claims. So in part, the original sin, as it were, is in thinking about the way these norms were understood in 1951 after the Refugee Convention. No country wanted to be forced to take in refugees. So they agreed, we will have these norms, we will have the spirit of international cooperation, I think is the phrase, but there is no legal obligation to resettle refugees, but there is the legal obligation to not refool them. And so countries go to great lengths to avoid having to return refugees.
Thank you. So our next question, I see a hand. The next hand was from R. Felix Finch.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, when it comes to we're talking about resettlement and the camps, I wanted your opinions on the failed attempt by the UK to take asylum seekers and relocate them to Rwanda.
Yeah, that was I mean it's ongoing. Like Rishi Sunak has promised to keep fighting the good fight to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. Even though the UK Supreme Court ruled that they can't do that. So this, I think, is a great example of deterrence policies, like peak deterrence policies, if you will. The idea is if you can convince refugees that if you manage to get into our country, we're going to make life so miserable for you that you shouldn't want to come here. And there are many ways they do that. They'll put you in detention centers. They will deny you the right to work, and et cetera, right to healthcare. And the UK is sort of taking that a step further and saying, not only will we do all those things, we will send you to Rwanda, a country where Rwandans are still seeking refuge in the UK. Ironically, so they consider it a safe country. It is, at least questionable that that's the case, but it certainly violates international law to take an asylum seeker out of your country and put them in another country. So countries want to claim they're under such burden by the numbers of asylum seekers, they should be allowed to do this. It doesn't violate their human rights at all, but consistently courts have upheld that it does in fact violate their rights, and you can't do that. So they're, going to continue to challenge this. The Remain in Mexico policy is a version of this, where you have potentially legitimate asylum seekers, but you're going to send them back to Mexico to wait for their asylum hearing. Oftentimes, the very gangs that they're fleeing are patrolling and working in these border regions. So it's terrible. But that's the idea. I recently read that. And it doesn't work, obviously, because people are deterred by these. I guess Mayor Adams went to Colombia. So he went to various countries in Central and South America to try to convince refugees that they shouldn't come, or migrants that they shouldn't come to New York. And what people took away from that was, Wow, New York must really be great if he doesn't want to share their resources with us. So reporters who would talk to people who had heard him speak would say, like, wow, like, I really want to go there now. So it's a great example of deterrence policies not only not working, but really having the opposite of effect. Um, but countries will keep trying, and in part because they feel that they have a popular mandate to do that. They feel like their citizens don't want them. If I want to get reelected, I have to show that I'm making life even worse for refugees than the next guy is. And many countries are doing this around the world, with very, very few exceptions. Every country has deterrence policies in place at the moment.
Thank you. So the next question is from Irene Sosa.
Yeah, I'm from Venezuela. It's like I'm completely confused about everything. Because one thing, Professor, thank you very much for your talk. Amazing. One thing is, we never heard that much of refugees. We heard the caravans coming through, Central America, and that's maybe 5 or 6 years old. We knew about people crossing the border illegally from Mexico, from everywhere. But suddenly in the last 2 or 3 years, and now they talk about refugees. So it's my understanding. So I was under the impression that the people that were asylum seekers, that were accepted in the United States as asylum seekers, are Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, I think El Salvador, and I don't know, Honduras. So my question is, everybody that is crossing the border are coming in and asking for asylum as they're being accepted. So for example, the Venezuelans wanted to be apprehended by the border patrol because they wanna, be registered, and they move on in the hope that they're going to get a legal status, right? We have other people that are here and then they apply for asylum. They have a little bit of money, so we can, with a tourist visa, and then they ask for asylum. But now everybody that is crossing the border is crossing the border and asking for asylum and accepted, because Venezuela have no relations with the United States, so they cannot send people back.
Right.
That's one thing. Another thing is, I was in a talk about Venezuela one day, and somebody mentioned, somebody that worked in an ONG in Colombia, that the Venezuelans are not considered refugees by the United Nations. Because every time that they apply for the status of refugee on the United Nations, Russia and China stop the boat. So, if you know anything about. So the first question is, everybody crossing the south of the border, or people coming all the way and ask for asylum, is everybody from every country, or just some countries that have this other, Venezuela, Cuba have no diplomatic relation, and okay.
Yeah. So let me try to answer that question. People are assessed on an individual basis, not a country by country basis, but with some exceptions, like Venezuela. So Venezuelans recently have a temporary protected status, which means that once you come into the US, you automatically are allowed to work for a temporary period of time. People entering from El Salvador from this time to this time might have that status. They come a day later, they won't have the status. Haitians had a temporary protected status for a particular time. And temporary protection status is really interesting. It's a way of acknowledging that you are in fact a refugee, but without having to give you permanent refugee status. So often it's the case that TPS, as it's called, is renewed repeatedly for years and decades and decades. But last Trump presidency, he immediately came in and said, okay, I'm ending all that. And people were terrified because they had lived here for decades and were going to be sent back to countries they didn't know anything about. Haiti is a really interesting country. So Cuba is person by person, so it depends on how you enter the US, and it depends on the circumstances. Haiti, we know that Haiti is an incredibly unstable country with extraordinary amounts of violence and poverty and persecution, but most Haitians are denied asylum status. In other words, there's a de facto presumption that if you're Haitian, you're fleeing poverty, not a sort of legitimate political reason, and therefore you will be denied political status. You know, this really interesting group of Chinese people are fleeing China because they feel persecuted. Their rights are taken away from them. They can't do this, they can't do that, they can't have. And so they claim persecution on the basis of being a political dissident or belonging to a minority or wanting to be religious. And those would be assessed on a case-by-case basis. But again, the assumption would be, look, if you're a poor Chinese man, you're here because you're an economic migrant, so you're not a refugee. So you really have to prove that you are fleeing individual persecution. So in other words, some countries, there's a de facto presumption that you're probably a refugee. Other countries, there's a de facto presumption you're not a refugee and you really have to prove it. And then for many, many other people, it's sort of up to you as an individual to be able to show this. You know, I do this exercise with my students in class where I say, okay, so imagine that, you know, you're in a country that's politically unstable. And, you know, you've known friends and you're part of a dissenting organization, and members of your group have been disappeared. You know, they haven't come back to class, they haven't come back to the dorm room. And you go back to your dorm room and you see a note that says, okay, you're next, you know, get out today or you're next. And you know they mean it. So you like frantically grab what you can and you hit the road and you catch the last bus out of your town and then eventually out of your country. And I say, what did you take with you? And most people will say, oh, I grabbed my wallet, I grabbed my phone, I grabbed some pictures, you know, I grabbed some underwear, or, you know, depending how practical you are. And I say, well, how many people would remember to take the note? And maybe 1 in 10, or, you know, have the foresight to realize like what I'm getting at with this example. But it's a really good example because it would mean that all of those people, all of the 10 people, 9 of them would not get asylum. The judge would simply say, look, you're from this country, we know what you know, people from your country are always trying to get into the US to steal our jobs, so forget it, you're not an asylum seeker. And maybe 1 in 10 can bring in enough evidence to say, no, look, I was really persecuted. So most people are in that boat. Now, when you're crossing over, like some people will claim asylum at the border, but like you said, others will come in on tourist visas, stay for 6 months, and then like don't even realize, like we overestimate, I think, how calculating people are. Like some people have never heard of asylum. They just happen to have, you know, found a way out, you know, through desperate measures, through different resources. They find themselves in the US on a tourist visa, or maybe they crossed without authorization. And then someone says, oh, why don't you claim asylum? And they're like, oh, what is asylum? Do I qualify for it? I have no idea. And then they will apply for asylum at that point. It could be that you're here, you're on a student visa and circumstances in your home country change and all of a sudden you can't go back anymore. You know, which happened to people in Iran, from Iran, for example, people who were, you know, involved with political protests or had family members who were involved with political protests a few years ago. So those are all kinds of different ways that people can claim asylum. And many people like know that they're not asylum seekers and they're like, look, this is the best chance I have at a minimally decent life. I'm going to come over and try to claim asylum and hope that I'm just, you know, allowed to stay in the US and can then sort of disappear and work under the table. So all of those people are here and are, you know, asking for help in different ways.
Wonderful. And then another question from Professor Daniel Campos, please.
Thank you, Serena. My camera is not working. So sorry, I am here just on audio. I have 2 questions and you can choose one to answer so that people have their turn too. One question I had is related to what you said. We have moral obligations to refugees because they suffer injustices we created. So one question I have is, what do you think of arguments that don't appeal to justice? You know, whether we created or not the injustice is not the central thing, but maybe that we have an obligation to care, or even maybe an obligation to love, in a caring way. That's one possibility. Why focus on justice and not on these others? Another possible question is when you say we created this injustice, so we have moral obligations. At what level would we start addressing the injustice? Is it like systemic? Do we need a global system, or can individual country sort of individual nation states start, regardless of what everybody else is doing? So either one.
Yeah, those are both great questions. Maybe I can try to answer them both quickly. I think some of the most effective work is being done by religious organizations for whom helping refugees is done from, as you say, from love, from care, from compassion, from humanity. And you don't need any further explanation for why you should help them or not help them. It's simply part of their understanding of what it means to be a good human being, is that we help, in particular, the alien, orphan, and widow from Matthew, book of Matthew for Christians, as being central to their understanding of what it means to be a good person. HIAS is the Jewish organization that was created in the aftermath of World War II, and initially only helped to resettle Jewish refugees, but then now is one of the largest refugee organizations in the world. And their slogan is, we used to help refugees because they were Jewish. Now we help refugees because we are Jewish. And I really like that, because it implies that what it means to be Jewish is to help refugees. So I think that basis actually motivates a lot of the best work that's being done for refugees around the world. But it's not for everybody. And people, so what do you do if you don't like refugees, or you don't care about them, or you don't love them? It's harder to convince people of that, but you might be able to persuade them that actually what we're doing is something that is actually wrong. I think they're both complementary, though. And I do think it needs to be done on a systematic basis. And I think actually, like, what we need to understand is that the refugee system is a structural injustice that isn't going to be made better by changing one set of asylum policies or one set of immigration policies. But we have to understand it as part of a larger system, for which it's incumbent for all countries to change their policies. But countries really feel like they're doing what their citizens want. And until I think that changes, until people realize what's being done in their name to migrants, the status quo will remain. People will try to have deterrence policies, keep it out of the news, keep people from talking about it too much. And things won't really change systemically. But there are a lot of people really doing incredible work to try to challenge norms around deterrence, challenge countries to change their policies. And I think, frankly, in the US, one of the things that's hardest is challenging democratic leaders when they're in power. The Biden administration, whether you like him or not, think with them or not, they have not done what we had expected them to do for refugees and asylum seekers. When Trump did similar policies, people were outraged. We were protesting every weekend. And it's very, very hard to do when the party in power is the party that is in principle less bad than the other party. So I think that's actually a real conundrum in the US, is how do we change policy systemically, when the less bad party has power. So I think it's a real world challenge for sure.
This has been truly illuminating and inspiring. I know that our speaker has other obligations, and many of you do. I'm sure we could talk for much longer, but let's just all thank Professor Parekh for this wonderful talk and for taking our time to
Thank you
speak with
so
us.
much. So it's so kind of you to invite me, and for all your kind words and for all the great questions.
Our pleasure. Gaston, did you want to take over for the wrap up?
Yes, just 3 quick points. And first of all, I want to invite you all to read Professor Parekh's book, No Refuge. For those from Brooklyn College, the Wolf Institute is providing free electronic access to the book. There's a link on the chat for that. I found it to be this amazing mixture of philosophy and experience, of beautiful storytelling and heartbreaking storytelling, a moral reflection. So please check out the book. It is a reading worth doing.
Thank you.
I also wanted to thank you for your work and for your voice. The conversation tonight reminded me that, as we seek to make the world kinder, more just, we need to listen to the voices of those who live at the margins of our society, who are the most vulnerable. But we also need to listen to the philosophers. So thank you. I'm a political scientist, and I often forget that, and we need to listen to the philosophers. So thank you for that. And, lastly, I just want to point out the next event on the series is on March 13th. with Ariana Peruzzi, who has joined us tonight, who apparently is a fellow Venezuelan with me and Irene. So hello. Right. But again, thank you so much, those of you who joined us, who were part of the conversation. And thank you so much, Professor Parekh and Professor Lindauer, for this really amazing, enlightening, important, and urgent conversation. So thank you so much. And we will see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again.